and welcome to another episode of Ask a Pianist. My name is Andrew Ahrens, and today we'll be looking at a concept which underlies nearly all voicing decisions we make in tonal piano repertoire. I'm frequently asked, how do you decide what notes in a chord to bring out? Or, more simply, why is this chordal note more important than another one? These are complex questions which have complex answers, but for the purposes of this episode, I wanted to focus on the fundamental principles of voicing chords. Simply put, note hierarchies in chords are based on the elements, the spacing, and the context of these chords. Once those three are locked down, then we can experiment outside of the convention. So, let's look at the first issue, that of the chord elements. Bach's Prelude and Fugue in C major from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier is one of the few pieces I can think of that has no melody. It is constructed solely of arpeggiated chords. Because of this feature, the piece serves as a superb study work when one is learning how to voice harmonically simple chords. Our first task when we are voicing a chord is to look at the pitch components. In other words, what notes do we have? Let's consider the first chord. It's basically a C major triad. Major and minor triads are dependent upon two elements, the root and the third. The root gives us the key, and the third gives us the quality. An absence of one or the other means that we cannot determine by ear what the chord is. Here's the triad without the third as an example. Is this a major or a minor chord? It's unknown. Similarly, without the root, we cannot know if the key is C major or E minor. The fifth of the chord can be considered as the least important. It's not entirely disposable, because in a given triad, we need the fifth to confirm the root of the chord. But in terms of voicing importance, the fifth is the most expendable. Let's apply this to our first arpeggio in the piece. We have this as written. Notice how Bach doubles the root and the third, C and E, but only has one G. Given this construction, Bach has by sheer numbers accentuated the root and the third of the chord, thus giving us a hierarchy which we don't necessarily have to tamper with. Now, it's not always this easy. In bar 15, we have the same C major chord, but it's constructed differently. Instead of the C and the E being doubled, it's now the C and the G that are doubled. In this case, Bach is creating a chord that is harmonically less stable than the first one, and we have to voice it accordingly. I said before that the root and the third are the most important notes in a major triad. This rule still stands, and when applied to this now less stable chord, it gives us an idea of what to emphasize in terms of voicing. The E, by not being doubled, is at an acoustic disadvantage, and though it holds an important place as the lowest note of the chord, we still have to give it a little more volume compared to the other notes. Instead of this, let's give it a little more body to sound like this. There's another adjustment that has to be made, of course. Since the G's are the least important elements in the chord, and because they are doubled, we actually have to remove emphasis or volume from them and have them retreat into the background. Instead of this, I pull them back to this. chords run along the same principles. Your root and third are the most important, and the fifth is the least. But what happens when we are dealing with more complex chords that involve sevenths, or augmented and diminished intervals within them? Well, this is where the rulebook gets thrown out in favor of looking at the construction of a chord as a function of dissonance and consonance. The rule becomes, the more dissonant a note is within a chord, the more importance it has within that chord. Let's look at a few choice examples. Bar 3 gives us a dominant seventh chord. Which note provides the most dissonance? Well, this kind of seventh chord is essentially a major triad with a seventh on top. The seventh provides dissonance against the root of the chord and the third. So from my point of view, the seventh is the most dissonant and therefore most important element of this chord. So if we build this chord in terms of importance by pitch, we have the F first, then the root G, and the third B, and the fifth D. There are two Ds. How do we know which one takes precedence over the other? In short, if Bach had written an F in the left hand instead of a D, he'd have two sevenths in the chord. This creates quite an ugly sounding chord because there's too much competing dissonance, not to mention that it would contravene traditional counterpoint rules. So Bach is, given the situation, forced into finding a chord note with which to fill in the gap, and the only other option is a D. Because it's a concession, rather than necessarily a first choice, I'd argue that the top D takes precedence over the bottom one, thus giving us this kind of hierarchy. F, G, B, then top D and bottom D. There you have a beautiful sounding chord. This example shows us why knowing your counterpoint rules is of serious importance when playing the piano. Voicing decisions cannot be made without a thorough understanding of both theoretical counterpoint and acoustic counterpoint. You have to know this stuff if you want to voice chords in a complex and thoughtful manner. Other complex chords, aside from the diminished chord, all have areas of consonance and dissonance, and their hierarchies can be built along the same lines as the previous example of the dominant seventh chord. What you're always looking for is a hierarchy of most dissonant note to least dissonant note, with dynamic alterations for notes that are doubled. So that's it for the elements of a chord and how they can be voiced. Now, let's consider how the spacing of a chord affects our voicing decisions. The first half of the piece contains chords which are spaced relatively close together. It's only when we get to the later stages with low bass notes where the chords start to spread out a bit. Is there a difference to voicing chords when they're close together as opposed to when they're spread out? I'd say yes and no. On the one hand, the rules of hierarchy regarding pitch importance stay the same regardless of distribution. In a C major triad, the E will remain the most important note regardless of the spread. But spacing is a problem that has to be approached from the perspective of acoustics, and this is where the voicing choices may change. On the piano, we find that close intervals that are naturally dissonant tend to create so much interference in sound that the pitch itself becomes slightly masked, to a point where we can have difficulty hearing separate pitches. For instance, if we play a third in the bass, we get a cumulative growl, as opposed to playing a tenth in the bass. The effect decreases as we move up the piano, but the principle remains the same. What this means practically is that the voicing that we would do for a widely spaced chord must be exaggerated when the chord is spaced closely together. This means that notes that are important must be made very important through dynamics, articulation, or sound quality, and the notes that are not important must be forcefully shuttled far into the background. I'll give you an example. Let's consider the chord in bar 8. It's a C major triad with a major 7th on top. But Bach has written it with the 7th on the bottom of the chord, like this. As it is a closely spaced chord, the B blends in with the C next to it, forming something of an auditory blur. If Bach placed the B an octave below, keeping the rest of the chord the same, you'd find that the B wouldn't blend as much and could be easily separated and focused on by the ear. If Bach had written it with the B in the bass, we wouldn't have to make an effort to voice it specifically for the listener. However, since it is in such close proximity to the C, we have no choice but to overemphasize the B and have the C next to it drop out slightly so that the audience can still hear the dissonance as both a separate pitch and as a blending harmonic effect. I mentioned briefly about how the blending effects seem to decrease as we move up the keyboard. Bach actually gives us a direct comparison in this piece. Let's take the same crushed dissonant chord that we have in bar 8 and compare it with the one in bar 16. It's the same chord in both bars, just in different keys and registers. The main dissonance in the chord comes from the two lowest notes. Now, the first time that we hear the chord, it's in the middle register, so it's not too difficult to acoustically separate the two lowest notes. Now, when the chord is lower in bar 16, we have to make extra efforts to keep the lowest notes from blending in and disappearing. This means that I have to overemphasize the low E, cut out the close F almost entirely, and focus on the dissonance created between the low E and the top F. That way, the chord remains transparent. So far, we've been looking at the elements that make up a chord and the spacing of that chord in order to determine how we can voice the chord in a way that sounds interesting. The last bit of the puzzle, which comes into play, is the context of the chord. This is a very broad subject, and it's not possible to make general rules about it. The function of individual chords changes from composer to composer and piece to piece, so you'll have to determine a set of principles for yourself regarding each individual case. To address this problem, instead I'd like to offer a version of this Bach prelude for you to listen to. What should you be listening for? Listen for similar chords and how they can be treated differently within the same piece. As an example, how does one major chord differ from another one being played later on? Another thing to listen for is how notes which bring dissonance to a chord can be used to melodically lead the ear towards the next chord. This can create the illusion of a string of harmonic sequences that are dependent upon single pitches within complex harmonies. And finally, listen to the dissonance-consonance tensions that are created not only within each chord by pitch, but on the general chord-to-chord level. You'll find this simple prelude to be acoustically far more complex than a first impression would give. Well, that's it for this episode of Ask a Pianist. Until next time, keep practicing, and never stop investigating the consonance-dissonance tension that impregnates every chord we play. You have the power to make these chords interesting, and all it takes is a little observation and a lot of experimentation. Bye for now.